Welcome to the Heart Failure Collaboratory Heart of the Matter podcast. Excited to have our guest today to talk about real-world evidence and how it can improve therapeutic development. And I'd like to go around the table and have my colleagues introduce themselves. Dr. Norm Stockbridge.
Hi, I'm Norman Stockbridge. I was the director of the Division of Cardiology and Nephrology at FDA's Center for Drugs for 20 years and retired the 1st of 2025 and consult now.
Thank you, Norm. Dr. Robert Califf.
Hi, Chris. Rob Califf here. I've been FDA commissioner twice, and I'm currently an instructor in medicine at Duke University.
Instructor. You went from professor, full professor, distinguished professor to instructor. That's you're
Been liberating.
waiting.
I can act like I know nothing and ask a lot of questions.
I love it. Nick Honig.
Hi, everyone. Nick Honig. I'm the executive director at Highlander Health and an attorney by training. I was previously head of regulatory at Aetion, a company that generates decision-grade real-world evidence with previous stops at Pfizer and the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome. And Maria Rosa.
I'm Maria Rosa Costanzo. I'm a heart failure and, importantly for this podcast, a transplant cardiologist. And I'm also a clinical trialist, and I'm currently working with the Midwest Cardiovascular Institute in Illinois.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here to talk about something that's really timely. If you look at the news today, real-world evidence is now a discussion point, an emphasis of how we can perhaps utilize to enhance therapeutic development. And I think, first of all, we've got to get off on the table, definition. So real-world data is the information that passes through our electronic health records or claims databases or registries. And that's distinct from real-world evidence, which is the information that's brought from those sources, from real-world data, to perhaps support a finding, a signal, evidence that in the context we're talking about, that a medical product might have a signal of benefit, of harm, or some outcome. But Rob, kick us off here. Real-world evidence. What is it, and how should we use it?
Well, real-world evidence I regard as what you have when you apply a method to real-world data. And a method could be an observational study, it could be a registry, it could be a randomized trial done in the real world, not in a research clinic. And so it's a very broad expanse of use of information, or what in every other part of the universe of commerce would just be called making sense of the information that you have using the best method possible. So I really do think this distinction between real-world data and real-world evidence is important, because people often assume that if you say real-world evidence, you mean some sloppy retrospective effort to make sense of data when you had no plan and no method. And Nick, who's on this call, has been part of an effort over years, funded significantly by FDA, to develop the methods if you want to make a causal inference from real-world data, which is a lot of what we're talking about here. If you want to not randomize and make a causal inference, there's a lot that you need to know that's now been pretty well defined.
And Nick, maybe we'll ask you to jump in and speak to that. I think we're all comfortable with randomized controlled clinical trials, the rigor, the discipline around that, the processes that go into the conduct of that. As Rob nicely outlined, there is a lot of variability about how people call information collection from real-world data as real-world evidence. There's variability there, and I think bringing that discipline, like we have with RCTs, to this is extremely important. You've been thinking about this for a while, so give us your thoughts.
Absolutely. I think that one of the main values of real-world evidence is being able to answer questions that the traditional clinical trial infrastructure may not be well suited to answer. I think that when you're able to administer a placebo or an active control and generate a sufficient N to generate appropriate statistical power to make a causal inference assessment, an RCT is great, and it should absolutely be the chosen route. I know that FDA operates through the perspective until, I guess it's changing now, but it was 2 adequate and well-controlled trials to generate substantial evidence that would lead to a drug approval. Seems that the current administration is shifting to 1. But where real-world evidence and underlying real-world data have tremendous value is in situations where an RCT is not feasible. It may be unethical to administer a placebo, you may lack equipoise, or you may not just be able to generate a sufficient patient population due to rarity of the disease. And we've seen a few case studies, even in initial approvals, where real-world data has been able to be collected and provide a external control arm, either matched or serving as a benchmark to assess against patients who have received the interventional product and generated data on how it's working. And, it's a very useful tool in the toolbox to getting these medicines to patients faster.
And so, Norm, your long experience in renal, cardiovascular drug development, tell us about how you have seen over the years real-world evidence augment our understanding of new therapies.
Yeah, there aren't very many good cases. It is often brought to bear under circumstances where the clinical trial data weren't persuasive, and typically it's not got a good basis for employment. It's not prospective often. Examples where there's good evidence, and I have trouble naming one.
You know, and certainly that sort of threshold of a new molecule getting over the finish line, it's not common. I think, Nick, you have a database of these, and there are a few examples that go, even beyond the cardiovascular space. I think oncology may have more examples. But in the augmentation of our understanding of those molecules, let's say it's a second-in-class drug, let's say it's a indication expansion, let's say it's a new safety observation, I think those are probably more, a little bit easier to accept that sort of information. Nick, what are your thoughts there?
I think that's exactly right. And cardiovascular as a therapeutic area is not the most conducive to real-world evidence use. You tend to see it used in ultra-rare diseases and then sometimes for oncology, although I haven't seen many substantial evidence use cases in oncology. Oncology tends to play by its sort of its own set of rules at FDA, and you're able to get approval on a basis of a single-arm trial in most cases. But I think probably the most famous example is tacrolimus to prevent organ rejection in patients who received lung transplants. And that was a case where it really highlights that FDA is interested in a strong data source that they can trust. The product had been approved since the 90s for solid organ transplant patients, liver, kidney, and heart. And the initial approvals had been based on randomized controlled trials. And then the drug was widely used in clinical care, including off-label for lung transplant patients. And the sponsor company actually conducted a non-interventional treatment arm and then compared it to historical controls using the U.S. Scientific Registry of Transplant Patients. And I named the data source because it's really notable here, I think, and it's crucial to the success factor, which is that because transplant reporting is mandatory, they had the full N of patients who had received this product. And FDA noted a few factors that it was excited about in this use case. It would have been unethical to conduct a randomized placebo-controlled trial because you couldn't randomize to nothing. And there was an established natural history showing that if you don't receive a CNI, there's a short survival rate. There is robust confirmatory evidence from the previous approvals, which really focuses on the idea of totality of evidence for an individual approval decision. And then it really helps that the effect size was massive. There was a 91% one-year survival rate compared to 0 in the absence of a CNI. So it was really hard to chalk that up to confounding, and that's it. And, this is a little bit of a perfect storm situation, but I think it highlights the roadmap for approvals based entirely on real-world data and real-world evidence.
That's a terrific example. And Maria Rosa, as a transplant heart failure physician, spent many years in this. Maria Rosa, we've also seen in the device world, when some of the newer LVADs came on, they used a comparator MCD registry, mechanical support registry, for as a control. So comment on maybe in the device space what you've seen as real world evidence.
Well, the first example that comes to mind is the HeartMate 3. And, just like tacrolimus, it couldn't be compared to not having a device. So it was compared to the HeartMate 2. And it turned out that the HeartMate 3 in the Momentum 3 trial, which was the pivotal trial, was superior primarily by avoiding the need for replacement of the pump, for malfunction of the pump, although survival was the same. But the interesting part that shows the importance of real world data is that the patients in the Momentum 3 trial were followed up to 5 years, and the survival at 5 years was 60%, which was excellent compared to prior studies. But data collected in the real world from a variety of centers that all do implantation of the HeartMate 3 showed that the 5-year survival in the real world is now exceeding the survival that was observed in the study, with survival rate at 5 years of 65 to 70%. So that's a critical example of how the real world data not only is not inferior to the clinical trial, but actually exceeds the clinical trial.
The Rob, a lot of people have the misconception that that a randomized trial is not as distinct from real world evidence, but you highlighted in your introduction that that's not the case. Is Gusto 1, was that a real world evidence trial?
I don't know what could be more real world. People roll in, the 41,000 people roll into emergency rooms randomized by their doctors while in the midst of a heart attack. And the total record that was collected was 3 sheets of paper on a fax machine. The data collected in real time by the clinicians taking care of the patient. And then the follow-up was done using pretty simple follow-up methods for dead and alive and a few other things. So, I mean, Chris, I got to say, this conversation reminds me again, we cannot spend too much time working on the definitions and nomenclature here of what we're talking about. I object to something about what each of my colleagues said, although they're obviously more expert in their areas than I am. I'm a generalist. But, I swear it's just a fact that God did not ordain that when you randomize, you must collect 500 pages of data and send monitors out to try to correct, the 99th element on the case record form that's never going to be looked at for any purpose other than academic purposes and general learning. And I've been in meetings this past week where I've had heads of R&D in big companies tell me that the cost of their clinical trials has doubled or more since the pandemic. And there's an article today in Stat News about the business of oncologists selling patients into clinical trials for very large amounts of money. And it's all because we built this artifactual construct of what a clinical trial is. Remember, the really great clinical trials that started it all were dealing with tuberculosis and, this enormous polio vaccine trial, which was really the first large simple trial that was done. We've got to fix this problem or we'll all be doing sloppy observational analyses because no one could afford to do what would give us the cleanest answer. So while, I agree with Nick on his definition, but I disagree with some of the ways he describes it. I agree with Norm. They're not great cases in cardiovascular disease, but I would argue that a lot of the best trials in cardiology have been funded by NIH and have essentially been collection of data in the real world. And I think Maria, very nicely described an application, which is a hybrid of real-world data, observational methods that could be just as easily applied to randomization. And the last point I'll make, I know I'm hogging time here. You mentioned oncology and rare disease. I mean, if there is no treatment for a disease and it is almost uniformly lethal, I think that is where, more than half of FDA approvals last year were for single-arm studies, but they were in rare disease where there's not another option. And while randomization would be beautiful statistically, pretty hard to look at children with a 100% chance of dying and say we're not going to offer any treatment at all when you have an experimental treatment. So I know that was a lot of stuff, so I'll stop there.
Well, let's go around.
May I
Yeah.
may I mention another example that is really changing the landscape of transplant? Is certainly in heart and also lung transplantation, and that is the donation after circulatory death. It has the expectation from the randomized clinical trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine called the DCD trial was that this type of procurement would increase the number of donors by about 5 to 600. And what we are seeing in the real world is that donation after circulatory death has already increased the number of transplant in the US by more than 1,000. So another example where the real world application of a new procedure can actually reduce the patients that die on the list and increases the number of transplants done yearly.
A terrific example of the hybrid that Rob is talking about. Nick, let me ask you to respond to Rob. He said you were only 50% right. Let's push back there a little bit.
I think I agree with Dr. Califf. I think that what it comes back to is being able to trust the underlying data and improve the efficiency and ease with which we collect data for this purpose. And I think that there are a few ways that we can do this. One is just obviously improving, data at the point of entry. I think that that's the $1,000,000 question. We don't want to ask clinicians to take on another day job. But can we think through other evidence generation approaches that maybe make this a little easier? I know that Dr. McCary has mentioned seamless clinical trials as something the FDA would like to see. I think that that would improve some of the infrastructure and startup costs. I also think pivoting towards trials with decentralized elements and incorporating some of the things that made pandemic research flow a little easier would be very helpful as well. And I think that there's a really interesting opportunity to understand how real-world data sources can generate needed evidence in the context of things like cell and gene therapy long-term follow-up. Because these are new products hitting the market that require 15 years of both effectiveness and safety tracking, and understanding how far you can get using things like record retrieval and tokenization of patients, where you then link them to claims data or mortality data to help ease that data collection burden and understand, what you might already have out in the ether that you can marshal together will be very helpful. And I know that we all like to talk about methods and methodological approaches, but I really think that focusing on the underlying data quality is key to proving out success.
Absolutely. And Norm, you and Rob date back to medical school, arguing against each other for many, many years. What are your comments about what Rob said?
Well, I think that the most of cardiology is not well suited for a data collection that compromises partly because of the limited effect size we typically see for interventions. But in principle, I don't think the cardiology division has pushed back on people who have proposed real-world collection from randomized trials. They run some risk of losing events and suffering some from possibly getting a smaller effect size than you get if you were doing a more structured trial. But in principle, I think there are things that people can do that they're not doing now.
Well, and I think the opportunity is so huge as I sit in this health system and see that we have 1 million patient interactions a year, 2,000 hospitalizations for heart failure in one single health system. There is, and less than 1% of those patients are being enrolled in clinical trials. An approach where we're enrolling patients and gathering this information so we can learn whether it's simple registry trials or non-randomized curated information, I think is extremely important. And one of the things we're doing, Rob, you'll be happy, it's taken me 30 years to do that. We're beginning to structure the clinical note so that it's the information in the clinical interaction with the that the physicians are collecting are structured data, and really trying to reduce the amount of characters. We're measuring characters of note size. We're measuring duration in the notes, and we're measuring how much structured data is going in there now, so that we can do what Nick said, and that is have a more disciplined approach to all this information that's passing through our health systems that we're not utilizing. So, last words. We'll go around the table. Rob.
Well, it's been a good discussion. It's obvious we got a lot of work to do to define what we're talking about, and I just also believe we really are entering a new era. For example, I saw a demonstration last week of filling out a case report form using AI that with a very high degree of accuracy and an acknowledgement by the AI when it's not sure, which then the human can follow up on. And our study coordinators who are at the meeting said that would save them an average of 2 days of work for that particular trial. And when you look at the fact that we have a plethora of targets now, both drug and device, the cost of the clinical trials is now emerging as a huge factor in limiting the portfolio of what companies go after. So this is something we need to keep working on. I'm glad to be part of the discussion.
Thank you, Nick. Last word.
This was a fantastic discussion. Very happy to be here. I think that we're in a period of change for real world data and real world evidence. We're seeing a lot of action coming out of FDA and increased use of real world evidence to support things like CMS price negotiation under the Inflation Reduction Act. But as these changes happen, I think it's really important to keep in mind the need for rigor around assessing data quality. And as we start to bring in all these different data sources and we look at sort of the life cycle of a data element going from creation at the point of care through ingestion and curation, and then through an output data set, and we start to combine all these different data sources together, we land at a place that we like to call at Highlander Health data mosaicism. And how do you actually interrogate the resulting quality of that data set and make sure that it's fit to analyze and produce decision grade evidence? So lots of work to be done and very excited to be part of it.
Thank you, Nick. Maria Rosa.
I would like to encourage all my colleagues not to shy away from a collection of real world data. And especially, I would like to encourage them not to shy away from, for example, post approval studies, because I think these are a little more structures, real world data collection that can lead to confirming or disproving or raising more questions about the preceding clinical trial. And I'm thinking specifically at the post-approval study that we did with the CardioMEMS device after the approval of after Champion and the approval of the device. The post-approval study in a larger number of patients actually really confirmed the results of our trial.
Excellent example. And Norm, last word.
There are some real opportunities here, and I hope people will avail themselves of it. I do want to point out that in his interview that he gave, McCary says, just send in your real world evidence cases and let the reviewers comment on it. I think that was terrible advice. You are better off getting prospective plan reviewed by the agency and taking into consideration the concerns they may have about the the methods that are being used.
Well, this has been a terrific conversation. Thank you, Norm. And I think lots of work to do, as we've heard around the table today. I want to thank my colleagues for being here this morning to share their ideas on how real-world evidence can enhance therapeutic development and how we can use it today and where we need to go going forward. And thank the audience for joining us today at
Thanks,
Heart Failure
Chris.
Collaborative Heart of the Matter. Thank you.